Welcome to Leader U by Black River Performance Management, where we believe work should fuel the human spirit, not drain it. In this leadership podcast, we will dive into the lived experiences of people flourishing in today's workplace and beyond. Join us to hear real-life examples of experiences from our own lives and from the leaders we know and trust. Today's sponsors are Radon Professionals. Oh, thank you for joining the Leader U podcast. I'm excited to introduce one of my favorite people and mentors that has really helped me to transform my life. Mona Bourbonnais is my guest today, and she is a professor and program director of surgical technology at College of Western Idaho. For the past 12 years, she was previously the program director at Boise State University for 10 years prior to that. She's also the interim director of the College of Western Idaho's First Assistance program, which is really new in her career. She has education. She got her certificate in surgical technology from Boise State, where she went through the program. She has her bachelor's in professional and technical education from the University of Idaho. She has a master's in adult learning and organizational leadership from the University of Idaho. She's a current member of the Faculty Promotions Committee at College of Western Idaho, and she's served on the Education and Professional Standards Committee of the Association of Surgical Technologists from 2015 to 2022. She's done multiple medical missions to the Dominican Republic and to Ecuador. She has a beautiful family, an amazing husband, Rick, and two amazing kids, and now a newly married one. She loves to travel, and I've been to more U.S. cities with this woman than most people that I know, to conferences. She loves walks. She likes to have paddleboard meetings in McCall. And she's just a really amazing human that I really wanted to bring on the podcast today because she was instrumental in my development and helping to model some of the behaviors that I needed when I didn't have the skills that I needed in the workplace. So thank you for being a guest here, Mona, and for being willing and vulnerable to not know what this is going to be about, but just trusting me. And I'm just happy to have you here today.
Thank you, and thanks for that nice introduction. So,
I added a few pieces about you like paddle boards and long walks on the beach and
paddleboard meetings, yes, which we haven't had one this year, so we're due.
We're overdue, absolutely. So I'd like to start off with having you share your story of, I know you probably didn't grow up wanting to be a surgical technologist program director. It probably wasn't in your path, but life has its way of bringing us to wherever it wants us to be. So could you start from kind of like the beginning, like what were you thinking about when you were younger and how did you end up where you are?
So I often think back to how I got here, how I got to where I am right now. And when I was a child, I had a lot of my parents' friends were physicians, and so we were kind of surrounded by medical people, and I was very fascinated by it as I was growing up. But it really had to do more with one of my classmates in seventh grade got hit by a car and was in the hospital for probably 3 or 4 months, and I would go visit her every day, and I just loved being in the hospital. I loved watching what the nurses would do every day. I actually felt like I want to be a patient so I can watch them more. So, and that's not a great idea, not a good way to get there. But I think that was my first fascination with the medical field. And when I first went to college, I went to University of Utah. Was not sure that I wanted to go into nursing, but I wanted to do something in healthcare. And so I took just health science classes and got quite a few credits. And then, as happens sometimes with life, I got married and married a professional hockey player. And we ended up living in New York and then went to Europe for 6 years. And so I kind of put my education on hold during that time. And when we came back from that experience, I decided I wanted to go back to school. Again, was pretty sure I did not want to be a nurse. And so I got a job at a neurosurgical practice just as a receptionist and kind of a back office person. I take patients back. And at that time, I was exposed to surgical technology because there were surgical technologists that worked with the neurosurgeons. And so I often think about the first people that open a door for you. And I think about that opportunity. Had I not started working there, I probably never would have heard about the career of surgical technology because a lot of people don't even know what it is. They assume that it's only doctors and nurses in the OR. They don't realize that there's another integral part, an integral profession in the operating room, and that surgeries could not be performed without them. And so I became very interested in this as a career, applied to BSU to become a surgical technologist, went through that program and was hired on right after graduation on the neurosurgical team at St. Al's. And so I stayed on that team for about 3 to 4 years. During that time, my husband and I adopted 2 newborns. And so we had a son, and then 2.5 years later, we had a daughter. And I did continue to work in surgery, although I was trying to stay home part-time to be with my children and then work part-time. And then an opportunity came up to teach. And the thing that attracted me to that mostly was the fact that I could stay home with my kids during the summer and all their school breaks and things like that. So it turned out that was my first motivation to do it,
Mhm.
which doesn't sound like a very good reason. But a lot of times things that work better for your family turn out to be the best thing that you could ever do. And
Mhm.
so that's where I got my start as teaching, and
Mhm.
then eventually became the program director and have stayed in that role now for 22 years.
Yeah. So, how many students do you think that have been through your program in that amount of years?
So, we typically there's some years we took 20 students, sometimes we took 16 students. So there's got to be about 400 students that I have put through in the 22 years that I have been with the program. And the one thing I always think of that I'm especially proud of is that every single every single student who has gone through this program has become a certified surgical technologist upon graduation. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the credential, once you graduate from an accredited program, then you sit for the national certification exam. And our program has a very high pass rate on that, usually 100%. And even though some students may have to take the exam twice before they pass, every single student that we've ever put through has eventually become a certified surgical technologist. Doesn't mean that they're still doing it, but they have all met that goal during
That's
that time
amazing.
and what they set out to do.
Hmm. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on the podcast too, because as a leader, that's what you're doing is creating the future the surgical technologists of the future. And I'm proud to be one of the graduates of your program at Boise State. And then I got to work with you alongside with you and be mentored by you, which is pivotal in my career and what has helped me to find my way. And also just having someone who believed in me in times when I didn't believe in myself or when my world got turned upside down by by external events that didn't have so much to do with my job or my life, but just my personal life. And so when I wanted to have you on the podcast, I was thinking about one leadership competency that would really fit. And I couldn't think of a more appropriate person to have the discussion about personal accountability than with you, because I feel like the operating room is the primary place where you can learn to have personal accountability as it relates to sterile technique, as it relates to admitting your mistakes, and all the things that you are trying to teach students, and things are valuable lessons that you taught me throughout the way. So, when it comes to personal accountability, what does that mean to you?
So if we're talking about what it means as far as a surgical technologist, I think about what we call surgical conscious or sterile conscious in the operating room. And that is something that we can tell people that you have to have that, but it's something that has to be developed. It's a personal accountability for when you make a mistake in the operating room, and especially if it has to do with sterile technique. We work in a sterile field. We are gowned and gloved, so we are considered sterile of the field, and we're touching only sterile items. But there's a lot of ways that we can contaminate those items during the procedure, and if that happens and we recognize that, we immediately need to stop what we're doing and rectify the situation so it doesn't spread to the entire field. And that's a really hard thing for students to learn. And a lot of it is because they're so afraid of making mistakes when they're in the lab and they're being tested, and their grade is reflected on how they do. So they're almost afraid to say when they've made a mistake because they know that will affect their grade a lot of times as we get further on. Early on in the program, if they say, hey, I just contaminated this, then say, okay, just keep moving on, and we'll address this later. As we get further into the program and start layering more and more responsibilities onto our students and what they have to do, it becomes imperative that they can perform those tasks and stay sterile. So they're so concerned about not making mistakes that if they do make one, even if they recognize it, a lot of times they do not want to admit it. And that's something that at this phase of the program where we're really trying to work on that. We tell them if we recognize a break in sterile technique and they haven't recognized it, or we kind of feel like they did and they didn't say anything, that's going to be a huge deduction off their clinical grade that week. And so trying to teach them the difference between, okay, I have to do all of this correctly. I know I'm going to make a mistake. And if nobody sees it, is it really a mistake? It's kind of like, if a tree falls in forest and nobody hears it, did it really fall? So that's the accountability that they have to have. They need to know that if they don't say anything, that it could lead to a surgical site infection for the patient, which not only is very costly for our healthcare system, but it could lead to a patient having to have more surgeries, spend more time in the hospital, possibly lose a limb if it gets really, really infected. So having them develop that accountability to every time they make a mistake, even when they're under the pressure of trying to be perfect, is really difficult. So I'm not sure if that quite answered your question, but that's what comes to mind as far as teaching people to take accountability for their mistakes.
And it takes time, doesn't it? It's exactly what I think of. It's a perfect example for life, too. Many of us are just trying to go through life, not making mistakes, not being accountable, not holding ourselves accountable. And that's a skill that has to be developed. It's not something that comes natural. Most people want to blame or shame other people or put it on somebody else instead of owning when we make a mistake and moving on.
Yeah. And I think especially in personal situations where you can justify your behavior, if you've made a mistake or you've hurt someone, you can tend to try and justify that and blame that person for your mistake. And to take personal accountability, you have to realize what your role was in that. And that maybe that other person's had some sort of a role, but you were the one that made the decision to do what you did. And so taking responsibility for that, owning up to it, apologizing to that person, and letting them know, what part you played in whatever the situation was.
Yeah.
I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think both of us have been in tandem in life where we've had that stuff happen in our personal lives and in our professional lives. And what I've learned in that journey is just that it feels so much better to be accountable and to own it than it does to try to pretend as if it was somebody else's fault or we didn't do it or whatever. Like it just feels gross.
It does, yeah, and it, you can convince yourself that as long as nobody knows that you did something, that it's okay, but it's really not okay. So coming to terms with the fact that if you have hurt someone inadvertently or in a very obvious way, and maybe they don't realize that, you still need to take accountability for that. And that is exactly what we do in the operating room. So just because nobody else sees you contaminate an item, um, doesn't mean you should continue to move on. At
Mm-hmm.
that point, you stop what you're doing and you rectify the situation, you correct it. And that
Mm-hmm.
should be the same in our personal life too, even though a person may not know that you've done something against them, um, or to possibly hurt them. Taking responsibility by owning up to that with that person, I think, is really important.
It is. I think it's what builds and heals and actually adds value to our relationships and building trust again.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I'm thinking this thing keeps popping into my mind. We had a student at one time and they were graduated from the program for quite some time before we heard about them scrubbed in on a case, and they ended up forgetting to open something up, and they decided, oh, instead of have somebody come open it up for me, I will just go ahead and open it up myself and throw it onto the sterile field. Well, that means that they contaminated themselves and then contaminated the field, but they would have rather contaminated the field and put the patient at harm versus say that they forgot something.
Hmm. Yeah, and I remember that situation really well too. And someone was looking through the window and saw this person who was supposed to be completely sterile, gown and glove, walk over, pick up an unsterile item, and put it on their sterile field. So they essentially contaminated their entire field because then they continued to touch everything else on there and thought that since no one was looking, that it would be okay. And that person was fired from the facility. And it was, both of us, I know, felt somewhat responsible for putting a student like that out into the real world where there was a real patient, because we stress that so much that no matter what the mistake is, own up to it right at that moment and not make it any worse. And to have someone that was a graduate of our program, when we stress it over and over, and a lot of what we teach are affective skills and professionalism and things like that, and that totally went against everything that we teach our students. So we felt responsible for that
Mm-hmm.
situation as well.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like the whole "you can lead a horse to water" thing,
Yeah.
but you can't make him drink. And I just think about that. That's really the definition of integrity. Really, is being a whole person that is the same in any instance, or just because nobody, or having character, right? Developing character and integrity. And many times we don't actually know what we would do until we're in a situation. And we like to judge other people because we'd like to think that we're better or we would do something different. But it's not always the case, I've
Yeah.
found.
Yeah, exactly. I know. It's very easy to throw stones at people until you're in that situation yourself and you don't know what you would do.
Yeah. But I think if you have personal accountability, um, that is something that you hold value and you hold dear. And when you do make a mistake, because you will, life will put you in reveal circumstances and people to just make sure that you are challenged to the nth degree. And
Mhm.
I feel like when we don't pass the test, we'll get another opportunity. But the idea is that we get a redo, and then the next time it's presented, that is that we don't have that same behavior. My only hope for that individual is that that was such a life-changing moment for him that either he's decided that's not a field for him, or that he would never compromise another person to make himself look better.
Yeah. And he is still practicing, and so hopefully he's changed his practice as far as accountability.
Mm-hmm. oftentimes when I'm doing workshops, people ask, like, are people changed? Do they change their behaviors and things like that? And the answer I often give is generally when something painful in their life happens, they get fired, they get divorced, their relationship goes downhill. Something painful is generally helps people to decide that that is not something they want to experience again.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I'm hoping that that was the case for him. So, oh, there's just so many things I want to talk about as far as personal accountability goes. What about in the workplace, or as you have students that are graduated, how does that show up? Or even in higher ed, what do you see?
Well, I think in the workplace, as far as in surgery, I see a lot of times when I'm in a clinical site and I see graduates of ours taking shortcuts for things that they know we had specifically told them never to take shortcuts on, no matter how much of a hurry they're in. And a good example would be someone who opened up a sterile set of instruments and looked into the tray and noticed that, there might be some bone chips or something in that tray. And instead of passing that entire tray of instruments off and asking for a new one, they're in a hurry and they go ahead and put that on their back table, maybe get rid of the bone chips or whatever, but it doesn't mean that that is sterile going onto their field. And I think as we are in the workforce and in the workplace and we are rushed even more in real time, people will tend to let um, their sterile conscious waver a little bit. I think they think, okay, it's more important that we just get this case going. We've got 5 other cases due in this room. And so they're going to just take a shortcut there. And no matter what we teach our students and what we expect of them as they are in our program and out doing their clinical rotations, once they're out on their own, they're on their own. And we can't be accountable for them. But I still feel responsible for them because I feel like somehow I failed to to show that person how imperative it is to keep those things in their practice all the time.
Hmm.
So it's hard when you see that. Um, as far as in higher ed, I think we all see people who will take shortcuts on doing certain things, or they'll just take information from somebody else because it's easier to do themselves, and that's okay as long as that person understands that, hey, can I go ahead and use what you did here? In fact, that came up today to me. I was doing a report on we're going through a program prioritization process, and someone in my department said, hey, I'm really struggling with a lot of this. Can you show me what you've done with yours? And so I sent them mine and I said, this is what I have done so far, and you are welcome to use any of my information. So as long as that person is asking and saying, I'm struggling with this, can you please share what you've done with me? And not just taking information if they have access to it and using it as their own.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, do you have any accountability lessons that you learned in the OR or in life that were pivotal for transformation of your effectiveness as a leader that you want to share?
Um, as far as in life, I think there's a lot of times, especially when you've been, married and maintained a relationship for a long time. I think there's a lot of times when that we may do things either consciously or unconsciously that hurt our partner or hurt our children, and being able to take responsibility for those things, and showing remorse, and showing that you're willing to change those behaviors to maintain a relationship, I think is really important. And, whether that's something in the workplace or if it's a personal thing, I think the longer you are in a relationship, whether it's a work relationship or a personal relationship, the more opportunities there are to hurt people in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't just brush those under the rug. If you've hurt someone, I think it's imperative, if you want to maintain that relationship, that you take responsibility. What was my part in this? How could I have done that differently? And how do you convince someone that whatever you did that was so hurtful will not happen again? And I think that's the hard part, especially if it's been something that is devastating either to a relationship, um, whether it's with a child or with a spouse. It takes time to rebuild those type of things, and that comes from examples that,
Yeah. I love that example. And I think you're right in the fact that the longer we're in a relationships, the more opportunities there are to disappoint, to let someone down, to even let ourselves down in so many ways. And I think a lot of times we're harder on ourselves in fighting that perfectionism, thinking, how could I do this? How could I? And just beating ourselves up. And the reality is that we are human beings and we don't even know what we're capable of or what we're not capable of. Sometimes we just box ourselves into our beliefs, which
Mhm.
aren't really our reality. Just because you believe you'll do something or won't do something doesn't mean that that's the truth. The
Yeah.
truth is somewhere out there that we will shock ourselves. We'll figure out that we're not as perfect as we thought. And I think that's part of wisdom too, just getting older and realizing that every single person has mistakes, regrets, things that they struggle with. But I think owning them is eases the pains. And like you said, apologizing, reconciling, learning, growing, and not just brushing it under the rug and just thinking like it's gone, nobody will know. It's more like it's more about me and that person or me and that patient or me and that student, me and that. And I know for a fact I've done so many things that I wish I could have done differently, and all I can do now is do differently moving forward.
Mhm. And, I think it's hard, especially as a parent, sometimes to admit that you've made a mistake to your child. It's easier to admit you've made a mistake to your spouse sometimes, and as a parent, you expect your children to apologize to you for your behavior when they do something wrong, because that's how we feel. We are helping them build their accountability. But if you've done something that has hurt your whole family, as a parent, it's really difficult to apologize to a child. And I think a lot of people don't. You may not have that opportunity to do it, but if you do and it comes up and there's something that you've done that's hurt your child, I think it's imperative to apologize to them, because it makes them more aware of when they've done something to other people, that's what they should do. And an apology is just an apology, but showing them a change in behavior is what's important as well. So you can apologize all you want, but if your behavior doesn't change, you don't do anything differently, then it's just words.
Or
So
manipulation.
mhm,
It's just manipulation if you don't change your
exactly.
behavior. Yeah. And I think that is the key. So that's what I hope for all. I hope this gets out to surgical techs. I hope it gets out to anybody that needs to hear or is struggling with accountability or personal accountability, because I really believe everybody's going to go through a stage or a phase or an incident in their life where they're struck by not wanting to face it, not wanting to face the accountability, not wanting to admit they've made a mistake, not wanting because of fear.
Mhm.
But the fear is on everything that you want is on the other side of the accountability piece. People can retrust, they can start to trust in you again. It takes time, but it's one of those things that it can be taken away in an instant, but you can rebuild it if the person is willing to be open, honest, vulnerable, and then we can start down that path of trust again.
Mhm. Yeah. One of the things that I think of a lot, and there's a couple different quotes that I really like. One of them is from Steve Jobs, that he says, "My job is not to be easy on people. My job is to make them better." And I think, especially when you and I taught together, that was kind of our goal. It's like they need to understand what they're getting into. They need to understand that this is surgery. There's a real patient on the table. Their actions could cause a patient to either become very sick or they could die. There's a lot of different things that could happen if they are not performing as they should. And so I feel like we are very hard on our students. We expect a lot out of them. But what I try and keep in mind a lot, and I have to remind myself of this every year with a new cohort, is another quote that says, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel.
Maya
So, no
Angelou.
matter how good we make our students, if they feel bad about some of the things that we said to them in the lab and how we said it to them, then that will stay with them a lot more than anything else that they learn during the program.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to keep that balance, I think, when you, especially when you are expecting so much accountability out of students. It's really hard to keep that balance. You need to be tough on them because you want them to be better, but you also need to do it in a way that it doesn't destroy them, their confidence, and
Mm-hmm.
make them feel humiliated in front of their peers, which as an instructor, it's really hard to do
It's a hard balance.
because of what we are teaching.
And you forget, not every student is going to experience it the same way. You could say the same thing to one student as you could say to another, but we don't know their backstory. We don't know if they came from a traumatic environment. We don't know their backstory. We only know where we're sending them, and that's to this environment. So as you're looking at it, something that might not affect you or somebody said to you could affect somebody else so much differently. And that's the hard part, because their backstory and how they were raised, or what goes on in their home life, or all these things could be what we say could be a trigger that could harm. But that was never the intention. The intention is to prepare them for this environment where excuses, they don't stand up. And one of the things I remember the most was giving feedback. And so even working with different organizations now, that's the biggest thing that we see in organizations. The two biggest problems we see is people not being able to give feedback. They don't like having the difficult conversations, or they're not good at it, or they fear it. And the other thing is holding people accountable.
Mhm.
And so I feel like that is what the program does. People don't like it. There's no doubt about it. And could we have done some things differently? Absolutely. But you don't know these things until you mess up, just like your sterile technique. You make a mistake and then it's like, that didn't go very well, or that wasn't my intention. It happens in every relationship. Like you said, with your significant other, when we say something, we do something, it wasn't our intention, but that's how it was perceived. And so our perceptions are reality. But we don't ever know where that person is. And if they don't tell us also, we cannot read their minds.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that I've learned over time working with students across the board is that the one skill that they miss is self-advocacy or self-efficacy, where they ask for what they need. And if they could do that and be like, I know I need feedback, and this is how I like to get it. I like to get it. Could you do it privately? Could you write it down? I mean, what way would you like to get feedback? And I know that when they get in the OR, it's going to be different. They're going to get it how they get it. But we're in it's a training area. So we have a little bit more space and grace to actually figure out what would be a better way to connect with this person to get them further along, because that's the goal. The goal is to get them further along. But one of the things that sticks out to me is our response when students would say, I know.
Mhm.
That wasn't allowed. If you know, then do it. Or if you know, like, no, you don't. Clearly you don't, because you're not, So that was one word, or I know was a sentence they weren't allowed to utilize. Do you still have that rule?
Yeah, in fact, we went over it just this week. What we do on Mondays now, prior to, or I guess on Wednesdays, we introduce a new procedure, new skills every Tuesday. And then on Thursday, they're tested on the new skills plus all the previous skills. So as I mentioned, we just keep layering more and more on top of them. And So we go over the rubric with them on Wednesday afternoon so they know exactly what they're going to be tested on, what we will take off points for, what type of things they may even have negative points added. And a lot of those now in this point, in this phase of the program, are like unnoticed contaminations, gross contaminations that easily spread to the entire field, um, unnoticed or unrecognized, as far unacknowledged, I guess, where they're not even acknowledging it. They just keep moving on. So we go over everything with them. This is where your points are. You can gain points. This is where you can lose points, and then we talk about at the very end professionalism and what they could lose points on. For example, if they become somewhat combative, when we are talking to them at the end, when we go back over the rubric with them and give them that feedback, which we do immediately afterwards, if they start to argue with the fact that, hey, no, I didn't do that, or I saw so and so do it, and I don't know if you took off points for them too, things like that, trying to blame someone else in their class, then we can take off those points. But we do bring up the fact that, and we don't want to hear you say, I know, because if you know, then why did you do it wrong? Or why aren't you doing it the way I've asked you to do it? And we don't want to hear an explanation of why you did it, because in the operating room, there's not a lot of time for that. You make really quick decisions on things. So we're not really concerned with your thought process on why you did something that was totally wrong. We just want you to do it right. Say, okay, thank you for the feedback. And so we stress that. This week was the first week that we really had to go over a lot of that, because we noticed that the more responsibilities that we give our students, the more they start to slide backwards in easier tasks that were early in the program. Even though we're repeating them over and over again, they focus on the tasks that are new and let the other ones slide. And they can't do that. We keep having to build on those same skills. Why not letting the earlier skills go? So
that's a great one. Do you have any behavioral, any behavioral pieces on the rubric for teamwork and things like that?
We do, and paying attention to the field. Like we're fortunate this year where we have 4 instructors in the lab. We have 4 students to each instructor, because we have 16, and I love that number, because, as you know, there's a responsibility for everyone during our mock surgeries when you have 4 students. We have someone who is the CST, someone who's the assistant, we have anesthesia, and we have a circulator. Everybody has to be engaged with that entire case, and there's no time for someone to go sit down and get on their phone. They are busy the entire time. And I notice a big difference when we don't have an outlier out there that's like, oh, well, I'm in a group of 5 or 6, so right now I'm not doing anything. I'm going to go sit in the hallway and eat my lunch, or I'm going to get on my phone or something like that. They have to be engaged the entire time. And so we have to remind them of what responsibilities they have if they're anesthesia or if they're the circulator, but they're always doing something, which is great. I love that.
Yeah, it keeps them engaged and it keeps them accountable. It's another way of personal accountability. Like, this is a team, and the team doesn't function without you. And we all need everybody coming and showing up and doing their part. And if you're not personally accountable, this is why I got fascinated with human behavior, was working in the operating room, is seeing how one leader could either make or break the case, or make or break the environment where people would speak up or where they wouldn't speak up, or they would tear somebody down. And then, it's so fascinating. But if the team works well, and when it works well, it's the most beautiful dance. And but it requires the entire team to be engaged, present, accountable, and caring about not only the patient, but each other person that they're working with.
Yeah, and everyone in the operating room has a role, but we also can't get so focused on just our role that we don't know what other people are doing, because a lot of times what they're doing, what anesthesia's doing, or what the circulator's doing before a case really affect our role. And so being so focused on, oh, I just need to get this back table set up, and then I need to make sure I have the right stuff on my Mayo stand. And you're so concerned with your own self, you're not noticing that anesthesia is trying to intubate the patient, and you're talking too much, or you're clanging instruments, things like that. So it's an awareness of everyone else's role and responsibilities, but knowing that yours are very specific, because then they all dovetail into everyone else's. And that's what, like you said, makes the dance, makes it go
Hmm.
really.
Yes. Have you seen any of the podcasts or TED Talks from Atul? He's a surgeon. Atul Gawande.
Oh, yes. Yeah. He's awesome. I love him, and he is in one of the videos that, and I know you remember which one it is, that we show the students every year. It's how to avoid mistakes in surgery.
Hmm.
And he's with the World Health Organization, and he is a part of that video as well. They interview him during there. So I have one of his books on Audible right now that I'm going to be listening to. So
What is that? So our listeners can know.
I'll have to go back and look and see which one it is, because I've gotten a couple of his on Kindle, and then this is an Audible one.
Hmm.
I'll tell you the name. I just knew it was from him, and so I downloaded it.
He
So,
has a TED Talk and a new podcast on Adam Grant on rethinking, and he talks about how, as a surgeon, he wanted to get better, so he got a coach. And he talks about how the higher up you get, the less feedback you get. And that's what I see working with executives and other, that oftentimes the higher we grow into our position, the less honest feedback we get from people. And so I think that would be a good one to share with students as well. And I was thinking back to all my days in the OR, and I never once saw one surgeon have a coach there observing them to give them feedback. I was like, he is a unicorn. He's an absolute unicorn.
yeah. And that's interesting that you say that, because I was thinking about this yesterday. When I went to Ecuador, we had surgeons from Philadelphia and New York, and they're all East Coast anyway. And I think we had, and then we had one from the West Coast, from UC Davis, that taught there. They were all ophthalmic surgeons. And they would go in and assist in each other's rooms, even though they didn't need to. The cases really didn't require an assistant, but they would go in and assist because they wanted to learn from these other surgeons
Hmm.
that were from different parts of the country. And somebody might make an incision in one place, another one in another place. And they, even though they knew that there were these different options, they were comfortable with what they were doing, and they've been doing them for 20, 30 years. But this was an opportunity for them to learn from someone else and a different way of doing it,
Hmm.
and a different outcome possibly for that patient. So
Yeah. Different
I
environment, different
really
tools
admire.
too. Lack
Yeah.
of tools, lack of all the things that you have in you, and also just a different place where when we are home in our normal environments, oftentimes we're just on the hamster wheel. But when you get in a different environment like that, it allows for thinking differently, for thinking new ways of doing things, and for opportunities for feedback. Where sometimes when we're in our normal habitats or environments, sometimes our ego gets in the way, or fear of what will people think if I have somebody in here giving me feedback? Am I not good enough? But I think there's always room for improvement. There's till the day we die, we can improve. On our deathbed, we could improve.
And I find that with teaching too, with four of us in the lab, we try to be very consistent as far as what we do on each procedure, so that we're not confusing the students too much, even though, as you know, you get in the OR and there's 25 different ways to do the same thing. But as a student, that's really difficult. It's a difficult way to learn
Hmm.
if everything's different every time you turn around. And so we're always conferring with each other. We sit in the conference room in the morning, and we'll say, okay, how do you guys feel about the way they hand this specific instrument or something like that? And we'll go over that beforehand. And we'll all learn from each other. And especially me, because I've been out of the OR for longer than any of them, even though I've been doing this for longer than any of them. They're the ones who are most current in current practice and what's going on in the ORs the students are going to be entering into. And so I really value what they say. They say, oh, well, this is how we're doing it now. Yeah, I haven't seen that for a long time. And I change my practice when we're doing mock surgeries because of that. Because if it's not relevant to the student, there's no use to keep continuing to do something.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I wanted to ask you to end on 3 like words of wisdom or tips or anything that you can share with our listeners as a gift, things you wish you'd learned, you learned the hard way.
Let's see. As far as what I learned the hard way, I think working in the operating room when I was still in the OR and I was practicing, I think, and we always have, kind of these rock stars that are in our program every year. And we think that person is going to be awesome when they get there. Well, I was somewhat that person in my class. There were a couple of us, but I was one of those people that, um, just got a job before graduation and I got job offers from multiple hospitals and things like that. So you kind of go in with a little bit of an ego in there. And I think understanding then when I got in there that I may have been a rock star as a student, but I certainly had a lot to learn when I went into the OR. And there were so many things that I didn't do as a student in my clinical rotations that I was expected to do once I got in there, and understanding that, yes, you are a big fish in this little tiny pond of these 15 students I think we had that year. But once you get into the OR, you are an entry level practitioner and you have so much more to learn. And I think that was hard for me because I was recruited by them and by multiple hospitals, and so you develop an ego.
Hmm.
But then understanding when you go in there, oh, I have so much more to learn. And so that is something I try and share with the students every year too, that just because you're getting like these sign-on bonuses and multiple hospital offers and things like that, you can kind of write your own ticket right now because there's such a shortage of CSTs and healthcare workers. You are not the rock star when you get there. You are still an entry level practitioner. You still need to prove yourself.
That's
Um,
awesome. One of
I
the
think
things.
that's in any profession.
Hmm.
Come out and you're in a new place, even if you go into a place with experience, everything is going to be done differently than the previous hospital that you went to. So don't go in there thinking that you are all that and they're
Hmm.
so fortunate to have you. You still need to prove yourself.
Well, it goes to one of our Black River tenets, which is confidence doesn't equal competence. And it doesn't matter. Like you can hire a CEO from a bank and then bring them into a nonprofit credit union. And then they still, or, maybe they're an accountant and they still have to learn the culture. They still have to learn about that place. They still need to learn their software. They still need to know there's so much that we need to learn when we switch jobs or when we even get into a new role. It's like taking a photography class. Once you start taking a class, you learn how much you don't know.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, there's all this other stuff like aperture and ISO and all this. And you're like, oh, wow, I thought I was a good photographer till you actually start learning more. And so I think if everybody got that message too, that confidence doesn't equal competence, and you are competent enough to get them to the point where they're competent enough to do any case and feel comfortable, but that doesn't mean they're good at it yet. They still have a lot to learn. And if there's one thing that I could do, it would be going back is switch my ego off early on too, and be okay with making mistakes and not thinking I had to be perfect.
Yes. Yeah. And I know you've heard me say this before, but another saying I love is you meet the same people on your way up as you do on your way back down. Because as you are progressing and you are building in your career, you're going to meet a lot of different people, and you may even be above those people at some point, but then you may end up losing that role for one reason or another. And then you are asking those same people who were below you for maybe a job opportunity. And if you didn't treat those people well as you were ascending to where you were, there you are not going to be someone they want to hire. So it's really important, especially I think, well, in any industry, but the medical community in Boise, Idaho is a small community, and everybody knows everyone, whether they work at the same hospital or not. And so if you don't treat people well, and then all of a sudden you are treat people well, or even treat other people well, like a student well,
Mhm.
or someone else, if people see you treating people poorly, and then you come to someone for a job, you are not going to be someone they want to hire. So no matter where you ascend to in an organization, you may find yourself going back down at some point. And it's really important to remember that.
It is. I love that saying. That's a good one. You see the same people on the way up as you do on the way down. That's great. All right. Well, thank you for taking your time and being such a great mentor to so many people. I just thank you for sharing your message with all of our listeners and thank them for listening to us. I hope that if this message was helpful or beneficial and you know people that want to know more about personal accountability or ways to teach it or ideas, please share and like and subscribe because this message needs to be heard by many. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and thank you for your time. Shout out to our sponsors of the Leader U podcast. Today's sponsors are Radon Professionals. Radon Professionals was established in 2003 in Pocatello, Idaho. Tiffany and Allie took over the company in 2016 and have been rocking the radon game ever since. Radon Professionals specializes in radon testing and the design and installation of radon mitigation systems across Idaho and Wyoming. What is radon gas? Radon gas is an odorless, colorless, tasteless, radioactive gas that comes from the natural breakdown of uranium found in most rocks and soils. Radon finds its way into homes or buildings, and according to the EPA, radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer. The only way to know if a home or building has elevated radon levels is to test it. Whether in its existing home, an office, or new construction project, they have you covered. The name says it all. They are Radon Professionals. When it comes to quality and professionalism, they've set a new standard. It's not good until it's great. They're nationally certified by the AARST and the NRPP. They guarantee their work and warranty their installations. Guaranteed results with every install. Radon Professionals. Call or text 208-317-3603. Or on the web, you can find them at www.radon-professionals.com or check out their Google reviews to see the awesome things their customers have to say. Thank you to the Radon Professionals for sponsoring the Leader U podcast.